November 25th, 1847, Thanksgiving night in Norfolk, Virginia. History remembers the feast. Few recall the massacre. Judith, 27, enslaved since birth, trained to serve silence, carried a wound carved by years of whips and betrayal. That night, when her mistress struck her for dropping a dish and threatened to sell her youngest child at dawn, Judith broke. She did not serve. She did not stay silent. She did not obey. With the axe she had long used to split firewood, she faced her mistress and 4 children who carried the family name. 5 lives ended before the candles on the table burned halfway down. This is the true story of the Norfolk, Virginia. The court called it madness. Judith called it justice, and history still trembles at her choice. Before we continue with this video, subscribe and watch this full crime documentary, because the ending will shock you beyond belief. Now you have to understand what Norfolk, Virginia looked like in 1847. Picture cobblestone streets slick with November rain, the scent of wood smoke curling from chimneys of grand colonial mansions that stood like monuments to Southern prosperity. The air itself carried the weight of secrets, tobacco leaves drying in warehouses, the distant sound of ship bells from the harbor where human cargo had once been unloaded like livestock. This was a city built on the backs of the enslaved, where white families gathered around mahogany tables laden with turkey and sweet potatoes, while in the quarters behind their homes, people like Judith ate scraps and slept on straw mattresses. The very floorboards of these elegant homes had been nailed down by enslaved hands, the gardens tended by people who would never taste the fruits of their labor. On Thanksgiving night 1847, as families across Norfolk bowed their heads in gratitude, the peculiar institution of slavery cast its long shadow across every prayer, every blessing, every morsel of food that touched their lips. The irony was suffocating, a day of thanks, built on a foundation of human bondage. The Whitmore family appeared to be everything Norfolk society admired. Thomas Whitmore, a respected tobacco merchant with interests in 3 plantations, sat in the front pew of St. Paul's Episcopal Church every Sunday, his wife Margaret beside him in imported silk. She was known throughout Norfolk's social circles as a woman of refinement, hosting charity teas for the poor, organizing church fundraisers, speaking eloquently about Christian virtue. Their 4 children, Thomas Jr., 15, Elizabeth, 13, Margaret Ann, 11, and little William, just 8, were the picture of Southern aristocracy, tutored in French, piano, and proper etiquette. Neighbors saw them as pillars of the community, generous employers who provided food and shelter for their human property. What they didn't see were the iron shackles hidden in the cellar, the whipping post behind the carriage house, worn smooth by years of use. They didn't see Margaret's collection of leather straps and wooden paddles, organized in a cedar chest like fine china. The Whitmores understood that their wealth depended entirely on terror, and Margaret Whitmore was a master of psychological warfare disguised as maternal discipline. Let's be real. Every successful monster needs a good story. The Whitmores sold Norfolk society a beautiful lie. They were benevolent masters who treated their slaves like family. Margaret often boasted at tea parties about how she personally taught her house slaves to read Bible verses, how she provided them with warm clothing and hearty meals. "Our Negroes are content," she would say with that practiced smile. "They sing while they work because they know how blessed they are." When visitors noticed a slave's swollen face or limping gait, Margaret had ready explanations. Judith had fallen down the stairs, or Samuel had injured himself chopping wood. The family even allowed their slaves to attend special church services on holidays, parading them through Norfolk streets as evidence of their Christian kindness. Thomas would publicly speak against the cruel treatment of slaves by other masters, positioning himself as a progressive voice of Southern humanity. This carefully crafted image provided perfect cover for the reality. The Whitmore plantation operated as a laboratory of human suffering, where psychological torture was refined to an art form. The more respected they appeared in public, the more invisible their crimes became. Behind the Whitmore mansion's elegant facade lay a carefully designed system of control that would have impressed any prison warden. The slave quarters weren't just simple cabins. They were strategically positioned to prevent escape. with clear sightlines from the main house and no cover for anyone trying to flee under darkness. Margaret had installed a series of bells throughout the property, creating an early warning system that could summon help within minutes if any slave stepped out of line. The basement of the main house had been converted into what Margaret called her correction facility. Windowless rooms with thick stone walls that muffled screams, equipped with chains, restraints, and an array of implements designed to inflict maximum pain without permanent visible damage. She kept meticulous records in a leather-bound journal, documenting each punishment, each transgression, each slave's breaking point. The kitchen where Judith worked was designed like a surveillance center. Margaret could observe every movement from multiple vantage points, timing how long each task took, noting any sign of defiance or hesitation. Even the family's daily routines were calculated to maintain psychological pressure. Sudden rule changes, impossible demands, punishments for infractions that existed only in Margaret's mind. When neighbors occasionally noticed something amiss, screams in the night, smoke from unusual fires, slaves who seemed unusually fearful, the Whitmores had perfected the art of plausible deniability. Margaret would explain away any concerning sounds as medical treatments she provided to sick slaves, positioning herself as a caring mistress nursing her property back to health. Those strange fires behind the plantation, simply burning diseased crops to protect the tobacco harvest. When slaves appeared at church with fresh wounds, Margaret would tearfully explain how she was forced to discipline them for their own good. "Spare the rod, spoil the child," she would quote, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The Norfolk community wanted to believe these explanations because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. Local authorities, many of whom owned slaves themselves, had no interest in investigating complaints about property management. The legal system treated enslaved people as livestock. Their suffering was simply the cost of doing business. Even when freed blacks or abolitionists raised concerns, officials would point to the Whitmores' sterling reputation, their church attendance, their charitable works as evidence that any accusations were fabricated by troublemakers seeking to damage good Christian people. Dr. Harrison Mills, Norfolk's most respected physician, made monthly visits to the Whitmore plantation, ostensibly to check on the health of valuable human property. In reality, Mills served as Margaret's medical consultant, advising her on how to inflict maximum psychological damage without killing her slaves outright. After all, dead property had no economic value. Mills had studied the emerging field of alienism, what we now call psychology, and he helped Margaret design sophisticated torture techniques that would break spirits while preserving bodies. He provided medications to keep severely injured slaves conscious during punishment, taught Margaret about pressure points that could cause excruciating pain without leaving marks, and even helped her understand how to use a slave's family bonds as weapons of control. When Judith's previous child had died under suspicious circumstances 2 years earlier, Mills had signed the death certificate listing fever as the cause, despite obvious signs of violence. His monthly reports to Thomas Whitmore read like scientific papers, documenting the effectiveness of various correction methods and recommending adjustments to their approach. Mills saw enslaved people as perfect subjects for his experiments in human psychology, free test subjects with no legal rights, no ability to complain or seek justice. "I want you to picture Judith as she truly was, not the mad slave that history painted, but a woman of profound intelligence and unbreakable will. At 27, she carried herself with a dignity that Margaret Whitmore found personally offensive. Judith had been born on the plantation, watched her mother die from overwork when she was 12, raised her siblings until they were sold away one by one. She could read, despite laws forbidding slave literacy, having learned by secretly watching the Whitmore children's lessons through doorway cracks. Most dangerously, Judith possessed what enslaved people called the sight, an ability to see through white people's performances to their true nature. She knew Margaret's charity work was theater, knew Thomas's business trips included stops at slave markets where he purchased children for unspeakable purposes. Judith's own children had been born into this nightmare, her daughter Sarah, now 5, already showing the hypervigilance of a child who'd learned that adults were predators, her son David, 3 years old, still innocent enough to reach for his mother when she entered a room. These weren't just Margaret's property, they were living pieces of Judith's soul, and Margaret wielded them like daggers aimed at Judith's heart. Every day, Judith watched her children absorb lessons in submission, fear, and self-hatred that would poison their spirits if they survived to adulthood. Samuel Richardson, the Whitmore's white overseer, had been hired 6 months earlier to manage field operations, but his conscience hadn't yet been fully murdered by the system he served. On that Thanksgiving evening, Samuel had returned to the plantation office to retrieve accounting ledgers when he heard the confrontation beginning in the main house. Through the kitchen window, he watched Margaret strike Judith with the wooden serving spoon, saw Judith's face transform from practiced submission to something far more dangerous. Samuel had witnessed enough of Margaret's discipline sessions to know that Judith's children would likely be dead by morning if something didn't change tonight. He'd seen how Margaret used the threat of selling children as her ultimate weapon, and how she followed through on those threats with chilling regularity. As Samuel crouched in the darkness outside the kitchen, he found himself facing a moral choice that would haunt him forever: intervene and risk his own life, or remain silent and become complicit in whatever horror was about to unfold. The wind carried the sound of Margaret's voice, sharp and cruel, promising to sell little David to a rice plantation in South Carolina, where children rarely survived their first year. Samuel pressed himself against the cold brick wall, his heart hammering as he realized he was about to witness something that would either end in Judith's destruction or Margaret's. Samuel Richardson never fully recovered from what he witnessed that night. When the Norfolk constables arrived at dawn, summoned by Thomas Whitmore's business partner who'd grown concerned by the family's absence from planned morning meetings, they found Samuel sitting in the plantation office, staring at the wall with the blank expression of a man whose mind had retreated from unbearable reality. The official report described him as temporarily unbalanced by shock, but those who knew Samuel understood that something fundamental had broken inside him. When investigators pressed him for details about the previous evening, Samuel could only repeat fragments. "She just snapped," he would whisper, the way a tree branch snaps in a storm. One moment bending, the next moment broken. But even as Samuel struggled to process what he'd witnessed, Norfolk's white community was already constructing their own narrative. This couldn't be about the brutal realities of slavery. It had to be about one woman's mental deficiency, a random act of madness that reflected nothing about their beloved institution. Newspaper editorials began appearing within days, written by men who hadn't been there, describing Judith as a naturally violent Negro whose inferior intellect had finally succumbed to animal instincts. They refused to examine what had driven her to that moment of explosive resistance. This is where the story gets truly chilling, not because of what the investigation discovered, but because of what it deliberately ignored. Judge William Carrington, a plantation owner himself, presided over the inquiry with the kind of theatrical solemnity that fooled no one who understood the stakes. The proceedings were designed not to uncover truth, but to reinforce the mythology that made slavery possible, that enslaved people were naturally inferior, naturally violent, and naturally ungrateful for their master's benevolence. Witness after witness testified to the Whitmores' exemplary character, their church attendance, their charity work, their reputation as kind masters. Dr. Mills provided expert testimony about Negro madness, describing it as a medical condition that occasionally afflicted slaves who were treated too kindly and thus developed dangerous delusions of equality. The basement correction facility was never mentioned. Margaret's punishment journals were never entered as evidence. The testimony of other slaves was deemed inadmissible. After all, property couldn't testify against white citizens. When Samuel Richardson attempted to describe what he'd actually seen, Judge Carrington cut him off, ruling that his testimony was tainted by traumatic shock and therefore unreliable. The inquiry concluded exactly what Norfolk's white community needed it to conclude. Judith was a mad slave who had murdered her benevolent owners in an unprovoked fit of savage violence. But here's what the official inquiry couldn't hide. The other slaves on the Whitmore plantation carried the truth in their bodies, their behaviors, their haunted eyes. Rebecca, the cook who'd worked alongside Judith, couldn't speak above a whisper anymore, flinching whenever anyone raised their voice. Old Moses, who'd tended the Whitmore gardens for 30 years, developed a tremor in his hands that made it impossible to work. His body's rebellion against decades of terror finally manifesting as physical symptom. Most telling was little Samuel, Judith's nephew, who'd watched his aunt's final confrontation with Margaret. At 8 years old, he'd stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through gestures and drawings that depicted stick figures with axes, houses on fire, and adults lying motionless on floors. These children and adults were living testimonies to what the Whitmore plantation had really been, a laboratory of human suffering disguised as a respectable household. When abolitionists from Richmond tried to interview the surviving slaves, they discovered that most couldn't even describe their experiences coherently. The trauma had fragmented their memories, created protective gaps in their recollections. Yet their physical reactions told the story their words couldn't. The way they automatically cringed when approached by white strangers, the night terrors that left them screaming Margaret's name, the compulsive behaviors that suggested rituals of survival developed over years of systematic abuse. Now you have to understand the calculated precision behind Margaret Whitmore's methods. This wasn't random cruelty, but systematic psychological warfare refined through years of experimentation. Her punishment journal, discovered hidden behind a false wall during the estate's liquidation, revealed the mind of a woman who approached human suffering like a scientist approaches a research problem. She had documented which combinations of physical pain and emotional manipulation produced the fastest submission, which threats were most effective against different personality types, how long a slave could be deprived of food or sleep before their productivity decreased. Margaret had even developed what she called mirror punishments, forcing slaves to witness the torture of their loved ones while being helpless to intervene, understanding that psychological trauma could be more effective than physical violence. She wrote detailed character profiles of each slave, noting their fears, their attachments, their breaking points, like a hunter studying prey. Her methodology included deliberate unpredictability, random acts of kindness followed by savage punishments, creating a psychological environment where slaves could never feel safe, never predict when violence would strike. Most chilling were her notes about children. She understood that traumatizing them early would create more compliant adults, and she had developed age-appropriate techniques for breaking young spirits before they could develop resistance. Margaret Whitmore had weaponized empathy itself, turning love and family bonds into instruments of control. Enter Jonathan Hartwell, a 34-year-old lawyer from Philadelphia whose own father had died in a cotton mill accident when Jonathan was 12, giving him a bone-deep understanding of how economic systems devoured human lives. Hartwell had come to Norfolk not as an abolitionist crusader, but as a bankruptcy attorney hired to settle the Whitmore estate's debts after the murders. He was a practical man, not particularly political, who'd planned to spend a few weeks cataloging assets and arranging sales before returning to his comfortable practice up north. But Jonathan carried something dangerous in his character, an inability to ignore injustice once he'd seen it clearly. When he began interviewing the surviving slaves to assess their market value, he noticed things that others had missed, the way they automatically assumed punishment positions when questioned, the identical scars on their backs that suggested systematic rather than random violence, the way children as young as 5 displayed the hypervigilance of war veterans. Jonathan had grown up poor, had seen how power protected itself through carefully constructed lies, and he recognized the gap between Norfolk's official story and the evidence before his eyes. Most importantly, Jonathan possessed something that made him uniquely dangerous to Norfolk's establishment. He had no social connections to protect, no local reputation to maintain, and a legal mind trained to follow evidence wherever it led. Jonathan's investigation began accidentally and became obsessive. While cataloging the Whitmore mansion's contents, he discovered Margaret's hidden journal and spent an entire night reading it by candlelight, his horror growing with each methodical entry documenting human suffering. The next morning, he began interviewing slaves not as property to be appraised, but as witnesses to potential crimes. He quickly learned to approach them carefully. Years of trauma had taught them that white men asking questions usually meant someone was about to be punished. But Jonathan's gentleness and genuine concern gradually earned their trust, and they began sharing fragments of their experiences. He documented everything: the basement torture chambers, the medical experiments, the systematic rape of young women, the sale of children as punishment for their parents' resistance. Jonathan realized he was uncovering evidence of crimes that had been hidden in plain sight, protected by a legal system that refused to recognize enslaved people as fully human. Working secretly, he began building a case file that would expose not just the Whitmore's individual cruelty, but the broader system that had made their crimes possible. He knew that presenting this evidence publicly would destroy his legal career and possibly his life. But Jonathan had reached the point where silence felt like complicity in ongoing atrocities. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where we discover that Judith's act of resistance was just the beginning, not the end. I need you to understand that what you're about to hear challenges everything we've been taught about American history, about the nature of slavery, about the moral foundations of our society. The evidence Jonathan Hartwell uncovered doesn't just indict the Whitmore family. It reveals a network of complicity that reaches into the highest levels of Norfolk society, connecting respected judges, prominent physicians, influential businessmen, and even religious leaders in a conspiracy of silence that protected systematic torture for decades. If you're still with me on this journey into America's darkest secrets, if you're ready to confront truths that textbooks still refuse to acknowledge, then subscribe to Shadow Stories and comment below with your location. Let me know you're brave enough to be part of this investigation, because what comes next will make you question everything you thought you knew about the land of the free and the home of the brave. We're about to discover that Judith wasn't a madwoman who snapped. She was a warrior who fought back against a system so evil that even today we struggle to comprehend its full scope. Jonathan's moment of truth came when he discovered Margaret's correspondence with other plantation owners, hidden in a sealed compartment of her writing desk. These letters revealed a network of plantation management consultants, wealthy women who shared techniques for controlling enslaved populations through psychological torture. Margaret had been part of what they called the Southern Ladies Improvement Society, which met quarterly to exchange methods for breaking slave resistance while maintaining public respectability. The letters detailed experiments in human behavioral modification that would have impressed Nazi scientists, systematic starvation protocols, sleep deprivation techniques, sexual humiliation strategies, and methods for turning family members against each other. Most damning were letters discussing the Norfolk method, Margaret's signature technique of using children as leverage to control parents, which other plantation mistresses were adopting across Virginia and the Carolinas. Jonathan realized he'd stumbled onto evidence of a coordinated campaign of psychological warfare spanning multiple states, involving dozens of prominent families who saw enslaved people as subjects for sadistic experimentation. One letter from a Charleston plantation owner praised Margaret for her innovations in Negro management, specifically her success in creating what they called perfectly compliant breeding stock. These weren't isolated acts of cruelty. They were part of a systematic program designed to refine the science of human subjugation. When Thomas Whitmore's business associates realized that Jonathan had discovered the correspondence, they moved quickly to silence him. Jonathan awoke one November morning to find strange men watching his boarding house, asking questions about his activities, inquiring when he might be leaving Norfolk. Understanding that his life was in immediate danger, Jonathan made a desperate decision. He would steal the evidence and flee north before they could stop him. On a foggy Tuesday evening, he returned to the Whitmore mansion one final time, using his legal access to load Margaret's journals, correspondence, and medical records into leather saddlebags. As he prepared to leave, he heard horsemen approaching, Thomas Whitmore's associates had anticipated his move. Jonathan fled through Norfolk's back alleys on horseback, the fog providing cover as pursuit thundered behind him. The chase continued through the night, Jonathan's horse laboring as he pushed toward the Maryland border. His pursuers nearly caught him at a river crossing, bullets whistling past his head as he urged his exhausted mount up the muddy bank. By dawn, Jonathan had reached friendly territory, a Quaker settlement where abolitionists could provide protection. But he knew that powerful men in Norfolk would never stop hunting him, would never allow the evidence he carried to see daylight. His old life as a comfortable Philadelphia lawyer was over. He was now a marked man, carrying secrets that threatened the entire Southern social order. When Jonathan reached Philadelphia with his evidence, he expected immediate outrage, swift justice, national condemnation of the horrors he'd uncovered. Instead, he discovered how deeply the conspiracy of silence extended into Northern society. Newspaper editors refused to publish his findings, claiming the evidence was too inflammatory and might incite dangerous passions. Leading abolitionists worried that exposing the full extent of slavery's psychological dimensions would undermine their more moderate arguments for gradual emancipation. Even sympathetic lawyers warned Jonathan that presenting such extreme evidence might backfire, making slavery's defenders seem reasonable by comparison. Most chilling was the response from federal authorities. They acknowledged the evidence's authenticity, but explained that interfering with property rights in Virginia would set dangerous precedents for federal oversight of state affairs. Jonathan realized he was confronting a truth too disturbing for American society to acknowledge, that slavery wasn't just an economic system or even just physical bondage, but a laboratory for developing techniques of human psychological destruction that were being refined and perfected across the entire South. The very people who claimed moral opposition to slavery were unwilling to confront its full reality, preferring comfortable myths about plantation paternalism to the nightmare of systematic torture that Jonathan's evidence revealed. His heroic escape from Norfolk had delivered him into a different kind of prison, one built from willful ignorance and moral cowardice. It took 6 months of Jonathan's relentless lobbying, but finally federal marshals agreed to raid the Whitmore plantation, if only to investigate potential mail fraud related to the estate's bankruptcy proceedings. What they discovered in that basement still haunts the official records, though most details were immediately classified to prevent public disorder. The torture chamber Margaret had constructed was sophisticated beyond anything the marshals had imagined. A windowless room with stone walls and iron rings for restraints, equipped with medical instruments, recording devices, and shelves lined with jars containing preserved human tissue samples. Dr. Mills's medical notes, discovered hidden behind loose stones, revealed that he'd been conducting experiments on live subjects, testing pain tolerance, studying psychological breaking points, documenting how different torture techniques affected enslaved people's ability to work and reproduce. The marshals found detailed anatomical drawings showing the effects of various punishments on human bodies, charts tracking how long different individuals could survive specific torture protocols, and most disturbing of all, photographs, early daguerreotypes showing enslaved people in various stages of physical and psychological destruction. One marshal's report described finding children's clothing in the torture chamber, suggesting that Margaret's experiments had included victims as young as 5 or 6 years old. The evidence was so overwhelming, so undeniably horrific, that federal authorities immediately sealed the findings and declared them state secrets to prevent social unrest. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that the Whitmore family's carefully cultivated veneer of respectability concealed a nightmare. Behind the polished image of genteel Southern society were monsters whose cruelty was not incidental but deliberate, systematic, and generational. Take Thomas Whitmore, for instance. To the public, he was a prosperous tobacco merchant, a man of influence whose business trips gave the impression of legitimate commercial enterprise. But the documents Jonathan uncovered revealed that Thomas was far more than that. He was a central figure in what investigators would later call the Virginia Circuit, a clandestine network of plantation owners who trafficked enslaved people not primarily for labor, but for experimentation. His journeys across the region were not trade missions, but recruitment expeditions. He purchased human beings selected for particular physical traits, psychological profiles, or perceived vulnerabilities, each destined to become material for Margaret's grotesque research projects. Margaret's own background only deepened the horror. Born Margaret Thornton, she was the daughter of a Charleston family whose plantation had served not merely as a site of production, but as a training ground. Overseers there were instructed in the mechanics of psychological domination, methods designed to break spirits as effectively as whips broke bones. By the time Margaret married Thomas, she carried with her generations of knowledge about how to control, humiliate, and dismantle enslaved people's identities. The marriage was less a union of affection than a calculated partnership. Thomas provided wealth and mobility, while Margaret brought specialized expertise in cruelty. Together, they transformed the Whitmore estate into a laboratory of suffering. Even the children were not spared from this legacy. Far from being innocent bystanders, they were groomed from the earliest ages to participate. Records and testimonies suggest that little William in particular delighted in devising imaginary infractions for enslaved people, determining who should be punished and how. What should have been childish play became an indoctrination into sadism, ensuring that the next generation would continue the cycle of brutality. Dr. Mills's history was no less damning. A background check traced his expulsion from medical school in Edinburgh, where he had conducted unauthorized experiments on patients. In the American South, however, he discovered a perfect refuge, an environment where his appetite for sadism could masquerade as science. The Whitmores and Mills were not corrupted by slavery's influence. They were drawn to slavery precisely because it provided legal, social, and economic cover for their most depraved impulses. For them, the institution was not just a system of labor, but a sanctuary for cruelty itself. This is where the story takes its most chilling turn, not in Judith's death, not even in the brutal machinery of the plantation itself, but in the systematic, society-wide effort to bury Jonathan's evidence and erase the truth about what had really happened at the Whitmore plantation. The cover-up wasn't the work of a single institution, but the coordinated silence and distortion of an entire culture determined to protect itself. Within weeks of the federal raid, newspaper stories began circulating in both the South and the North. Instead of portraying Judith as a woman who resisted torture, they reframed her as a cautionary tale, a dangerous example of what could happen when enslaved people were treated too kindly and allowed to develop unrealistic expectations. This wasn't sloppy reporting. It was a deliberate inversion of reality, a calculated attempt to turn resistance into pathology. Medical journals soon joined the chorus. Physicians who had never examined the evidence, never even set foot on the Whitmore property, published articles describing Judith's madness as clinical proof that abolition would unleash widespread violence by formerly enslaved people against white families. These pseudoscientific arguments lent credibility to slaveholders' fears, and their language echoed for decades in justifications for segregation, mass incarceration, and eugenics. Politicians wasted no time exploiting the moment. Southern legislators cited the Whitmore case as proof that harsher slave codes were necessary. They argued that lenient masters like the Whitmores endangered the entire social order by failing to enforce discipline with sufficient brutality. What happened at the plantation, they claimed, wasn't a symptom of cruelty. It was the result of too much mercy. In this twisted logic, Judith's suffering disappeared, replaced by a narrative that made her responsible for her own fate. Perhaps the most effective reinforcement came from the pulpit. Prominent ministers across the South preached sermons framing Judith as a biblical warning, a living example of what happened when people rejected their divinely ordained station. Instead of challenging the morality of slavery, they used her story to bolster it, citing scripture to sanctify subjugation. Northern churches, fearful of losing Southern congregants and donations, largely remained silent. Some even echoed the Southern line, preferring unity over truth. The resulting conspiracy of silence was not orchestrated by one hand, but emerged organically from a society that understood, whether consciously or not, that acknowledging the full truth about slavery would require acknowledging their own complicity. To admit Judith's humanity, to face the reality of her resistance, would mean dismantling not just the Whitmore plantation, but the entire social and economic order upon which America had been built. And so, denial became its own form of violence, ensuring the myths endured. The aftermath of Judith's defiance reveals everything we need to know about justice, or rather, the absence of it, in antebellum America. The system had always been designed to protect itself, and her case laid that truth bare for all to see. Judith was executed swiftly and publicly, marched to the gallows in Norfolk's Central Square on March 15, 1848. Accounts differ on the details, but several witnesses recorded her final words, "I die free." That statement, both a declaration and a condemnation, was the only justice she was allowed. Yet, when we trace what happened to the other figures involved, the picture becomes clear. Those who enabled, concealed, and profited from atrocity faced no reckoning. Instead, they were absorbed back into society, rewarded with greater influence, and even celebrated for their respectability. Take Dr. Mills, for example. His role in experimenting on enslaved bodies was neither hidden nor punished. He simply packed up his papers, relocated to Texas, and continued his gruesome research on newly established plantations until the Civil War finally disrupted his operations. The women of the Southern Ladies Improvement Society, who had crafted their genteel image while directly abetting torture, simply shifted their activities after the war. Many re-emerged as prominent figures in organizations dedicated to preserving white supremacy, disguising racial terror as scientific discourse and civic improvement. Their legacy would outlive them in the very structures of Jim Crow. Thomas Whitmore's associates fared even better. They absorbed his assets after his death and expanded the plantation network, incorporating Margaret Whitmore's psychological techniques to maintain order across larger territories. What had begun as one family's cruelty became a model of control imitated by others, proving how oppression doesn't die with individuals but mutates into broader systems. Judge Carrington, who had overseen the cover-up of Judith's rebellion, faced no disgrace. On the contrary, he was elevated to Virginia's Supreme Court, where he spent decades crafting rulings that entrenched slavery further, stripping away even the minimal protections enslaved people sometimes claimed. Perhaps the most chilling detail lies in the fate of Samuel Richardson, the overseer. Rumors spread that he intended to publish an account of what he had truly witnessed on that fateful Thanksgiving night. But in 1851, he died suddenly under suspicious circumstances, silencing him before his revelations could ever reach the public. In the end, the only person who paid with her life was Judith, the victim who dared to fight back. Those who orchestrated, benefited from, and legitimized the machinery of torture not only escaped accountability, but climbed to even higher perches of influence. That imbalance tells us everything about how power protected itself in America's darkest years. Now, you have to understand that Judith's story is not merely an isolated historical tragedy. It is a mirror held up to the present, reflecting uncomfortable truths about power, resistance, and moral courage that continue to shape our world. To treat her act as just one desperate outburst in a cruel era is to miss the larger significance. Her axe wasn't simply a crude weapon aimed at the Whitmore family. It became a blade that slashed through the thick veil of comforting myths that American society has long used to soften the horrors of slavery. For centuries, a dangerous narrative has been cultivated, one that presents slavery as a regrettable but ultimately necessary economic system, or worse, as a structure guided by benevolence and paternalism. Judith shattered that illusion in one violent, unforgettable moment. Think about how slavery is often represented even today. Textbooks flatten it into an economic abstraction, reducing it to labor systems and trade networks, erasing the blood, terror, and intimate cruelty at its core. Museums too frequently emphasize plantation architecture, fine furniture, or the wealth of the enslavers, while relegating the torture chambers, whippings, rapes, and psychological warfare to footnotes or whispers. Even narratives that praise enslaved people's resilience often sidestep the systematic brutality designed to crush that resilience in the first place. Each omission, each distortion, is not innocent. It is, in effect, a victory for Margaret Whitmore's worldview, a worldview that sought to normalize domination and erase resistance. And while we tell ourselves that slavery ended with emancipation, the techniques perfected on plantations like the Whitmores didn't vanish. They were repackaged and redeployed in new forms, in prisons that reproduced labor exploitation under different names, in mental institutions that used control and dehumanization as treatment, in military training programs that conditioned obedience through psychological and physical torment, and in law enforcement practices that too often mirror plantation discipline. These systems persist, and their roots can be traced directly back to the plantation order. Judith's act of resistance exposed the fragile foundation upon which oppression stands, the victim's forced acceptance of the myths that justify their suffering. By raising that axe, she wasn't only seizing a chance at personal liberation, she was striking at the entire edifice of lies that made slavery palatable for those who profited from it. Her legacy survives in every refusal to accept sanitized versions of history, in every demand that we confront how power disguises its cruelty as natural order. So I leave you with this haunting question. Could something like the Whitmore plantation happen today? History has a way of disguising itself, of shifting its costume while keeping the same script. Would we even see it coming? Or would we be too distracted, too caught up in the polished surfaces, the glossy photographs, and the carefully orchestrated acts of public generosity to recognize the horror underneath? It is so easy to be seduced by the image of philanthropy, to admire those who donate to schools, sponsor charities, and attend community events, all while ignoring the faint cries rising from places we've been taught not to look. Think about the organizations we trust without question, the corporations whose products we buy daily, the governments whose rules we follow without protest, the institutions we treat as infallible. How many of them depend, quietly and consistently, on someone else's suffering, someone else's invisibility, to function so smoothly? Judith of Virginia died with the conviction that her agony, her sacrifice, would shatter illusions, that it would force those around her to finally confront the brutal truths they were so desperate to conceal. She believed her voice would echo, that her pain would awaken consciences numbed by convenience and tradition. Yet instead of sparking transformation, her story was smothered, silenced, buried beneath layers of myth, denial, and deliberate distortion that have survived across generations. The silence surrounding Judith is not accidental. It is engineered, maintained by those who benefit from forgetting. And so we must ask ourselves, what stories are we ignoring today? What suffering are we allowing to be erased because it is easier to consume comforting lies than to face unbearable truths? If you are ready to keep digging into the shadows of America's past, if you want to join those who refuse to look away from the unsettling evidence that contradicts official history, then stay with us. Subscribe to Shadow Stories, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment with your location. Show me you're part of this search for truth. Share this video with someone willing to face the darkness, because the only way we honor victims like Judith is by refusing to let their memory be sanitized or obliterated. And next week, we'll step into another chapter, 1692, Salem, Massachusetts, where the infamous witch trials were not about supernatural terror, but about greed, power, land, and the calculated weaponization of religion. What you'll learn there will force you to question everything you thought you knew about America's founding myths.